recorded, I guess I don't have to only worry about audio mistakes, but also video mistakes now. Okay, I appreciate that the Kahal HaKadosh invited me again to share words of Torah. Of course, on a very somber day. The remarks will try to focus on the seriousness of the day, but also Kanahog and also the Menagim of Klal Yisrael indicate that already afternoon on Tisha B'Av we look more toward the future in terms of Nechamot, which is part of what I primarily wanted to focus on in the interrelationship between the quite intense, sorrowful commemoration of Tisha B'Av and all of the tragic events throughout Jewish history. Of course, primarily focusing on Churban Habayis and everything that occurred within that milieu, but as the Kinos themselves know, as anyone who has looked into it indicate, that Tisha B'Av is used as a forum for mourning over all of Jewish tragedy. But to start off with just the first motivation of what's going to frame our brief remarks this afternoon is two personal experiences. So today, of course, is Tisha B'Av, and unlike most of the time that Tisha B'Av is commemorated on Sunday, it's a rare year in which goes hand in hand with first day of Pesach falling on Sunday, with Erev Pesach on Shabbos, which is not going to happen for another 20 years, and so on and so forth, all the calendaric idiosyncrasies that I'm sure were discussed before. But normally Tisha B'Av is pushed off from Shabbos when it occurs, where it's commemorated on Sunday. The day after is either the 10th or the 11th. This year is the 10th. So as a result of that, of course, in the standard minhagim, both Ashkenazim and Sephardim, each in their own way, some of the laws of mourning are extended. Again, standard Ashkenazic practice, till Chatzos, all of the rules of the 9 days, and eating meat and drinking wine. Also till Chatzos, Sephardim actually are more machmi here concerning meat and wine, that it goes throughout the next day. That, of course, is classically based on the idea that the Beis Hamikdash was actually set aflame, as the Gemara in Tainus states, toward the evening of Tisha B'Av. And the primary burning of the Beis Hamikdash is actually on the 10th, so the morning is extended. Okay, but with all the extensions, so we get to 11, and then it's all over. So just the personal experiences, actually from summer camps, which I haven't been at for at least 20 years, maybe more. That's as an adult, and that's a camper for more like 40. So when I pretty much went to every sleepaway camp that existed, and I remember on the 10th of Av there was a countdown. So when noon was approaching, so they got on the loudspeaker, and whatever the division head or the head counselor would be saying 30, 29, 20, right, till Chatzos, and then they would blast the music as they always did in camp to make it a lively environment. So, as a camper, certainly not in any way like studying deeply in Yoni Mikdash, I knew that Tisha B'Av was sad with time, and being close to God was a good thing, but certainly not with the intensity we all try to add as we mature, but basically as an impressionable child, so it's over. Like, now we can be happy. So as I got older, and coupled with the fact that as a member of teaching staff on a different camp that I didn't go to when I was younger, so they had a very somber but very artistic mural of Churban. It was on a main road between, I think, where the residences were for the staff, for the head staff, till the dining room. And so every time you passed it during the 3-week period, so you'd always see, like black and burning and like silhouettes of Mikdash and kind of a sad environment. And right at the Tisha B'Av, they flipped it, and on the other side of that wooden mural was, a very sun-filled picture of Mikdash and Binyan Yerushalayim, and as an adult, so like once again the feelings of okay, now it's all over. Now we're happy. So partially inspired by the fact that I had to write a Dvar Torah some time ago, and it happened to be around Shabbos Nachamu. So I just tried to put those two memories together and try to sort out in my mind, like, what's going on here? Now, indeed, the halachic experience, which informs our feelings, right? There's Rabbi Soloveitchik Zatzal on a famous shir he gave on Korach. He said, he'd always stress the idea that first the halachic act, then the emotions. Because if first the emotions, then how do you know the emotions are really plugging into what Hashem wants? Emotions are very subjective. So just looking to the halachic act. So on Tisha B'Av, of course, it's all about mourning, and the period leading up is all about mourning. And somewhat surprisingly, though I'm not going to develop that too much now, and both Rabbi Soloveitchik Zatzal and L'Chaim L'Chaim Rabbi Lev Shlita both independently noted that it's a reverse kind of mourning. Because normally when you have Avelus, you have the most intense Shiva, and then Shloshim is less, and then Yud Beis Kodesh is less, and then you let go of the Avelus. Memories always will exist, there's always sadness. Some was close to the relative, certainly, but the formal halachas end. And here, all the more highlighted by the Ashkenazic practices, but certainly in the Sephardic practices as well, it gets more and more intense. 3 weeks, 9 days, Shavuot Shechalbo, Tisha B'Av, and then it just stops. Again, you have a little bit of a transition with the extra minute tacked on of Til Chatzos. So it's quite even more shocking that, okay, now we're happy, even more intense, boom, now be happy. So I wanted to use that as the frame to discuss and to quote great people that have shared various Divrei Torah, and with that to try to, just to finish the thought, so even in the halachic systems, so what happens right away? Of course, the mourning goes away, it's the blank, but then famously, even though it's interesting, it's not recorded in the Gemara itself, but it's considered authoritative. It's from, I think, a Torah Sheba'al Peh work called Psikta Rabasi, but that's, of course, Minhag Yisrael unanimously followed, and that's the Shiva D'Nechemta. Right? And most famously, this week, which actually is the two kind of festive occasions coming together, Shabbos Nachamu together with Tu B'Av. I might have done the math wrong. I think I did it correct. I just quickly did.
You did math
9 plus 6. There's even a ritva that says that the reason that Shabbos Nachamu was always considered is before hotel getaways. So the ritva says the reason why Shabbos Nachamu was considered a very special Shabbos, even in his day, because it was around the time of Tu B'Av, which the Gemara in the Mishnah and Tainus says was one of the most festive occasions. And then you have Nachamu Nachamami, the other Nachamos, all the way up till Rosh Hashanah. So we're supposed to live what we read, live the Kriyas HaTorah, live the Haftarahs. So the halachic system is calling out to us, like, seemingly, be happy. Everything's okay. Hashem loves us, and there'll be Nechama. But there's no Beis HaMikdash, and there's no open Shechina. And again, our very unique kind of era where so much good has been happening in the slow, medium, whatever you want to call it, march toward the Gula Shlema. But it's important to take a step back and realize, but so much is lacking. Secularism, inter-division strife between the religious and secular. And of course, we all long to daven at the Kotel, but we're even more longing to daven on the other side. Yeah, not getting involved in controversies, with tefillah, without, but the wrong building is there. And a famous story that I'm sure you've all heard of in 1967, right, when they conquered Har HaBayis, so they put a gun to some sheik's head and said, take us to the holy wall. So one of the religious soldiers noticed that you were more at the headquarters before you went down to the wall. But of course, there's a block from that happening. So obviously there's a lot lacking. So where is there room for just stopping of all the mourning? Shouldn't we have, like, obviously Chazal ordained, but they ordained for reasons. Shouldn't we have like a slow drip of the 3 weeks, all the time? So that's what I wanted to focus on a little bit in the time we have remaining. So, there are two kinds of kinos. They're very starkly different from each other. The first part, most of which begin, or a chunk of which I should say, begin with the word Echa, or variations of that, Echo, and then the Tzion series toward the end. So, not exclusively, because you have a little bit in each one, but the Echas normally deal with absolute disaster, mourning, feeling a lack. Most of it actually focuses on physical destruction. Again, not to go into details now, but with all of Jewish history, but when you study the events of Churban Bayis Rishon and Churban Bayis Sheni, besides the spiritual effects, but the enormity of even if you take some of the midrashim perhaps as exaggerations, right? That's not apikoursis. Sometimes Chazal say about themselves that sometimes they speak in exaggerations. And certainly if it's not exaggerations. We speak about the amount of blood spilled, how many people were killed, even in Beitar. All the more so in Yerushalayim. And those who study the history, the second Beis HaMikdash, the tragedy was compounded because the siege began on Pesach. So that means everyone was being ola regel in middle of a slow war, but it hadn't been the intensity of the siege. So the amount of people that were just killed in Yerushalayim, even leaving aside the Churban Beis HaMikdash itself, was triple, quadruple what it ordinarily would have been. The enormity of that tragedy, and that's what the Paitanim always liked, even though it's still hard with all the hard words, Baruch Hashem for Art Scroll, but so it suddenly hit me that, why did they make these so hard to figure out? Wouldn't it have been easier to write it like more of a Hu Rachum style, easy Hebrew words, and you could express the same thoughts, but without all the midrashic references. So I suggested throwing it out to the tzibur, but obviously it still needs work to be able to appreciate what's going on, because it's all about mourning and crying, and you don't cry in prose, you cry in poetry. Poetry is an expression of emotion, of song. So it wouldn't be the same if those screams would be expressed only in regular words. But of course the trick is to pick up on the let's call it the mournful tune, so to speak, of the poetry, to be able to appreciate that majestic outpouring of emotion. So it speaks primarily, at least many of them, about the physical tragedy. How many lives were lost? How many men, women, children, and were brutally massacred? And moving on to other stages of history, crusades, and even Jews who took their own lives rather than convert. And then you turn to the Tzions, which again are not exclusively that way. And this primarily was highlighted to me by my Rebbe of Hershel Shechter, once gave a shir on this, and it just suddenly hit me that that's what it says. So Rabbi Yehuda Levi's famous one, Tzion al-Shali, and other Tzions, some of which is not clear who wrote them. But when you take a list, you can even write down on a piece of paper, it lists about, maybe without exaggeration, 50 wonderful, wonderful things that only occurred both in Eretz Yisrael as a whole, and specifically in Mikdash, when all of Klal Yisrael were there, and all the more so, Bayis Rishon even more intense, when there was open Shechina. So it's a different mood. One is focusing on tragedy, and one is focusing on what life could be like when we have Geula. Now, of course, then it turns around and says, and all of this we don't have. Right? I mean, one of the most famous written by a famous poet, Rabbi Yehuda Levi himself, right? That I'd rather run around unclothed, without shoes on, rolling around in your dust, talking about Eretz Yisrael, than be anywhere else in the world. So, but if we take a step back, and none of this is my own ideas, it's primarily from things I've heard from others. This specific formulation, I think I once heard on an audio shear from Rav Shimshon Pincus, that those are read as far, I heard as shiurim, so of course a very brilliant man, very big tzaddik, but to me, one of the most unique talents that he had was the power of mashal. Just giving a very, very powerful contemporary mashal to relate to something very deep. So one of the things he said is, on Tisha B'Av, the Rebbeinu Shalom lets you feel how things really are. All the rest of the year, so a little bit of a fake kind of existence. On Tisha B'Av, like rolling in the floor, that's the way things really are when there's no open Shechina and Har HaBayis and all of Klal Yisrael evolving around the Kadosh Baruch Hu in intense avodas Hashem. So when that's not there, and that's all of Tanakh is that way, and the Tochacha and the Torah. So when that's not there, so the ramification of that is that all the physical tragedies happen. So they're all two sides of the same coin. But since we're human beings, and it's easier to relate to the physical tragedies rather than the lofty exalted ideas, so perhaps that's why the kinos are set up that way. I don't know who the editor of the kinos were, right? There has to have been an editor who decided what goes where, because they were written by so many different authors. But clearly there was someone, some mysterious man who had the forethought to put them together in a way that could allow to a certain progression of ideas. So the beautiful Dvar Torah that so far just been discussing concepts that I heard some years back in Masas Mordechai. I live on Nachal Dolev now. So this year I actually wasn't speaking there, but quite a number of years. I believe it was Rav Shimshon's brother, Lahavdil Mechayim L'chaim, Rav Yosef Binyamin Pincus Shlita, who I think is a Rosh Hashiva or a Rebbe locally. I'm not sure where he lives, but he always gave a beautiful Divrei Torah. And the thought that he tried to develop was the following. One of the reasons that at least the minhagim are to some extent lifted after Chatzos, the intensity of minhagim, put the parochas back, sit on a chair. It's interesting because some people think you're allowed to greet people. That's against what it says in Shulchan Aruch, but I just happened to notice today with my son that in Masechta Sofrim it actually sounds like that after Kinos you're allowed to greet people. But that's not the psak. But the basic thing is that minhagim are lifted. The dinim apply all day, but the minhagim to some extent are lifted. There's also a practice which poskim can take different stances on, but a lot of them justify it, that there's a minute to clean the house that many women had, sweep and mop, etc. And that was in a sense a certain longing for geula. And
our house is always clean. I know it's clean.
And why is the longing for geula more appropriate then? So on a simple level, because we know Hashem loves us, and even though we mourn, but we want to also have hope. But the poskim also point out that that's when the Beis Hamikdash was set aflame. So that should be more available, not less. So they quote the famous idea that's actually a Gemara in Kiddushin, Lamed Aleph and Beis, not my Bekias, but Rav Pincus's Bekias, that Avimi Darshan, that it says Mizmor La'asaf, which is one of the program of Tilim that many say, especially in intense periods of tragedy and war, etc., Ayin Tes, Mizmor La'asaf, and then it speaks about Bo Goyim Nachla Secha, Samus Yerushalayim La'iyin. So why is it Mizmor La'asaf? It should be Kina La'asaf. Come back to that in a second. So the Avimi explains that because the Goyim came and destroyed the Mikdash, so as the famous expression goes from the Medrash, right, that based on Eicha, that Hashem was Shafach Hamaso. He poured out his wrath al Eitzim Vavonim, meaning on the Mikdash. So he didn't kill us, or at least didn't destroy us totally. There were many, many Jews who were killed. But we survived. as a nation. He took out his wrath on the Beis Hamikdash. So he asked the kasha that I guess was probably nagging all of us for many years, but maybe thought it was like apicorsis to ask. Off to take, classes in anger management, but you can see if someone's angry and they don't want to punch the one they're angry at, especially if you're Italian, right? So you'll take a china plate and smash it against the wall.
That's healthy.
Take out your anger, so you won't take it out on the person.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that the Medrash is making that idea kiviyachol about the Melech Malchei Malachim, but that's not everything we know. The Kedusha V'Tara about the Melech Malchei Malachim. So what do you mean? Shafach hamoso al eitzim v'avonim. Going to take out my anger on stones, so now I won't be angry at you. How does that make any sense? Again, I'm sure there's much to be said about that. I'm sharing Rav Pincus's beautiful interpretation. So he gave a mashal of a couple, speaking about it, about friends, any other relationship, father-son. He spoke about a husband and wife. So there's something very rotten with the relationship. But yet, they know that they do deep down love each other and they want the relationship to continue, but it can't go on as it is. So the person, whoever is in control, whatever, husband, father, roommate who pays the rent, whatever, says, I need you to leave now and stay away until we're ready to come back together. So what is that? An expression of anger or an expression of love? So if it's an expression of anger, it's get lost, never come back. Right? The way the master of the Suda told Bar Kamsa, get lost and never want to see you again. There's no come back later, when... So that's what Rav Pincus explained, that perhaps is what Chazal are driving at by Shafach hamoso al eitzim v'avonim. Because what was that shficha al eitzim v'avonim? It meant the intense relationship of you, Klal Yisrael, all living in Eretz Yisrael, revolving around revealed Shechina and the Mikdash. That has to take a break. I throw out as a question, because I saw a beautiful video a long time ago about Minyani Mikdash. And the person who had put it together, it's before AI, right? Very masterful presentation, and quoted many Gemaras and many Midrashim, created a great longing for that, what that represents. So I quoted a Gemara, which I didn't quite succeed in finding. So if anyone knows where it is, chapter and verse, I'll be very indebted. Speaks about Geula as a period of Nisuin. And to just use the language that my Rabbi Shechter used to always use, what's the difference between an Asua and an Arusa? They're both married, as we know from Gemara. Right? Not the Arusa of modern Hebrew, which means engaged, but the Arusa of Halacha. So they're both married, but as anyone who studies Ksuvas Kedushin, an Asua is Eishes Ish Bebeis Habal. They're not only married, they're living as husband and wife. And therefore, the immediate ramification, all the rights and obligations of marriage only kick in then, with rare exceptions. An Arusa is technically married, but she's not Bebeis Habal. The way couples act during engagement is kind of the way an Arusa would, except for the fact that you need to get to break real Erusin and not engagement. So Geula is Klal Yisrael, the wife, Kiviyachol, as Shir Hashirim indicates, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, are living in the home, so to speak, the marital home, the center of which, as we also spoke about in the Kinos, speaks about the loyos, about the kruvim hugging, right? That's why that's members only. No goyim are allowed there. Right? It's one of the famous things that Josephus talks about this, that maybe he put the words into his mouth. Josephus was a big speechwriter, but Titus screams at the Jews and says, we allowed you to have a stone on your temple that says no strangers past this point. They found that stone. I'm sure many of you have probably seen it. It's written in Greek. No strangers past this point, meaning Harabayas, yes, but not into the Azara. So I'm not sure what the original makor of that is. Midrashim speak this way. Also the Mishkan is like a kalav, Kalas Moshe. That's like the marital bedroom. This is only for the couple, no strangers. So that's Nisuin. And Golus is only Kiddushin. So normally in halacha you can't downgrade from Nisuin to Kiddushin, but hashkafically what happens in Gulf, we're still married. As HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I promise you I'm never going to divorce you. Eza get creases and sati lachem. But it's only Erisin. I thought he quoted a Gemara in Yoma. I was on the road to almost finding it, but I didn't quite find those words. If you find it, please let me know. So that's what Rav Pinkus, again, Rav Pinkus Shlita, Rav Binyamin Pinkus explained that's why that's time for happiness. Because that indicates that Hashem still loves us. And He cares enough about us that He temporarily says, I need you to leave now, but I'm going to call you back. Again, within all of our historical processes, relatively soon. And then we'll go back to Nisuin. That has been explained very beautifully, that Avimi, in that Gemara in Kiddushin, Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, that we quoted, so the story goes that his father, his elderly father, asked him for some kind of cup of drink or something, wine or whatever, and by the time he got it to his father had fallen asleep. So loyal son that he was, ready to keep Kibbut Ava'im L'Mahadrin, so he just stayed there until his father woke up. But he didn't want to bottle, and he wasn't a Mora, so he's like thinking, what could I think about? What Torah could I darshan now? And then he thought about that. Mizma la'asaf. Kina la'asaf kamen boyale. And then he came up with that idea that the fact that the Ribono Shel Olam allowed the Goyim to destroy the Mikdash was an act of love. And not an act of what we would call classic anger and divorce. So why Dafka then? So he said very nicely that here he was, obviously, again, maybe he was like, but I don't really want to do this. But we imagine that an Amora acted in a way where it filled his entity. He really felt a love for his father, in addition to fulfilling the Ratzon Hashem. So he was contemplating, suggested Rav Pinkus, the enormous connection between a father and a son. And by extension, a husband and a wife. And of course, by extension, our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is expressed in both ways. And then he darshaned, Mizma la'asaf, Kina la'asaf kamei boyle. No. This is also not only for our good, but as an expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's love. So, our Chazal, with their intense wisdom, realized that we can't always live in a sense of Avedus. And therefore, we feel HaKadosh Baruch Hu's love in two ways. Sometimes with the intensity of Avedus, with which all of that entails, how much we're lacking, how terrible it is, the way the famous Medrash comments on Oy Lebanim, right? The Gemara in Brachos speaks about that. Oy Lebanim Higleisiosam Mishulchan Ha'av, right? That how terrible it is to be distant from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But other times, and yes, even immediately after Tisha B'Av, because all of that mourning in a more hidden way is also an expression of Hashem's love, that not everything's good yet, but there's all one common denominator. Both the destruction and the longing to the future are all expressions of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves us. Maybe if I have to redo what they had in camp, that the sign would go like this all the time, during the 3 weeks and maybe the whole year, to show that both are true. Wanted to end with just one other quick idea, if I may. That's in the Shemona Esrei that we say every single day. Those who have studied, to some extent, the topic of Geula, will see that there are two ways in which Geula could occur. The sudden way, which is sometimes called the Geula of Achishena, rushed Geula, and the gradual way, which is sometimes referred to as the Geula of case. Much has been written about this, especially in contemporary times. The Shemona Esrei says, "Umei v'goel levnei v'neihem l'ma'an shemo." What does that imply? That he's bringing Geula because of his own sake. that sounds like that we don't really deserve a Rosh Geula because we're not doing tshuva. And nonetheless, he's doing it because that's what he wants to do for us. And how does it end? Maybe goal of Nehem, even though we're messing up and we're not deserving of it, but Hashem's still going to jumpstart the process. B'Av. Which means even when things are not going according to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's plan, but that the intensity of love he has toward us is so great that even of Geula that's only brought about because that's his agenda for the world, and he's not going to let our Averos hamper that, it's still done with great love. So, Yiratzen, that B'ez Hashem, that the longing for that intense relationship, which is spoken about in the latter half of the Kinos, should lead to a situation where the Tisha B'Av should become, as promised by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the Navi Zechariah, into a great Yom Tif, because as many of the commentaries explain, because it's Dafka the morning where we indicate that we want that Ahava, so that becomes the source of the Yom Tif of Tisha B'Av.